The sun hung low in the sky, casting a fiery orange glow over the Arizona territory as the wagon creaked and groaned along the narrow trail. The wheels, half buried in thick, dusty red dirt, kicked up clouds that swirled in the oppressive heat. It had been hours since they'd crossed the last sign of civilization, and now, the only sound that echoed across the barren land was the thumping of the horses' hooves against the dry earth. Inside the covered wagon, Clara's body writhed in the confined space. Her hands were tightly bound behind her back with rough rope, and a gag was shoved deep in her mouth, stifling her desperate attempts to scream. The faint smell of sweat and fear filled her nose as she fought against the restraints, kicking her legs in vain against the wooden walls of the wagon. The air was thick, heavy with the heat that pressed down on her chest, but Clara didn't care. The heat was nothing compared to the gnawing terror that gnawed at her insides. Her eyes, wide and frantic, darted from the slats in the wagon's walls to the men sitting lazily in the driver's seat. They were too comfortable. They didn't know the rage burning in her veins, the relentless determination that no amount of fear could extinguish. Clara refused to go down without a fight, refused to let them win. The mento, rough, scarred faces who'd been her captors for the last few days laughed and shouted to one another as the wagon jolted forward. They didn't notice her thrashing, too lost in their drunken haze. One of them, a grizzled man with a crooked nose, took a swig from a flask, glancing back only briefly. His cold eyes met hers for a moment, but he turned away without a care, too confident that she was nothing more than a helpless prize. But Clara wasn't helpless. She refused to be. The pain in her arms from the tight ropes was a dull throb, but it fueled her defiance. She jerked her legs again, straining against the bonds, her muscles screaming. The gag, though painful, was no longer enough to keep her silent. She whimpered behind it, her throat raw, but her will remained unbroken. The men didn't understand. They didn't know she had a fire inside Heron that had only grown brighter since they'd taken her. They thought they were transporting her to some far-off place where no one would find her. They were wrong. She had nothing left to lose. Her family was gone, her home burned to the ground, and now they thought they could take her too, treat her as nothing more than a prize to be sold or worse. But Clara was strong. She had fought harder battles, and she would keep fighting, no matter the cost. Her mind raced with thoughts of escape, each more desperate than the last. She could hear the men laughing, oblivious to the impending danger. They thought the journey would be easy, just another simple run through the dry, desolate lands. But Clara knew better. There was someone on their trail, someone who had been following them for hours. And that man, that cowboy, was going to change everything. With every ounce of strength Clara had left, she kicked harder, her feet scraping against the wood. She could feel the ropes shifting slightly, just enough to give her hope. If she could get her hands free, if she could grab hold of the reins or the knife she knew they'd left carelessly in the back of the wagon, she would have one chance to escape, one chance to survive. But as the wagon bounced along the rocky path, Clara's gaze shifted toward the front, her heart pounding in her chest. The men were still laughing, still oblivious to the danger that was coming. They wouldn't hear the hooves until it was too late. She just had to hold on a little longer. Talon Blackwood rode through the dusty hills, his weathered face hidden beneath the brim of his wide hat. His horse, a sturdy bay with a glossy coat, trotted steadily, its hooves kicking up a soft trail of dust behind them. The sun was low on the horizon, casting long shadows that stretched across the barren Arizona territory. The land was empty, desolate in every direction, but for Talon, it was home. A home he had never quite found peace in. He had been tracking the wagon for hours, drawn by a gut instinct he could never fully explain. The scent of smoke still lingered in his nostrils, an odor he knew all too well, and it had led him to the trail of a group of men moving through the desert. He wasn't sure what they were up to, but he knew one thing: it wasn't good. His horse moved with practiced ease, navigating the rough terrain with the quiet determination that matched its rider. Talon's past was full of regret. his memories haunted by the choices he had made, the things he had done. A man of few words, he had built his life around a single rule: don't get involved. The world was full of pain and suffering, and he had long learned that the more you cared, the more it could destroy you. But something had shifted within him since he had first caught sight of the wagon. The flicker of movement in the distance, the desperate struggle of the woman inside, the look in her eyes that reminded him far too much of someone he had failed to protect. He had seen enough to know that people like her didn't have many chances in this world. She didn't deserve to end up in the hands of men like those, men who had no honor, no morals. The kind of men who took what they wanted and left nothing but ruin in their wake. Talon's jaw clenched as he shifted in the saddle, his hands tightening on the reins. He had been running from his own demons for too long, but now he could see something clearer than ever before. He could make a difference here. He couldn't keep turning away, not when someone needed him. The sound of the wagon's creaking wheels drifted through the still air, a steady rhythm that echoed in the distance. Talon's eyes narrowed as he adjusted his position, taking in the scene before him. The wagon was moving slowly. The men perched in front, their casual demeanor betraying their dangerous nature. He didn't need to get any closer to know that this wasn't a group to be taken lightly. They were rough, experienced, and far too comfortable in their crime. But Clara, the woman bound inside, was struggling. Her body contorted with each futile attempt to escape, her movements desperate. Talon's heart quickened, and for a brief moment he allowed himself to feel the weight of her pain. He had spent so many years shutting down that part of himself, the part that cared, but now it surged to the surface, raw and untamed. He could see it in her eyes, the fear, the defiant sand. It stirred something deep inside him. He was no hero. He had never wanted to be. But as the wagon drew closer, the decision to act came to him without hesitation. He would intervene, whether it was what he wanted or not. He had failed too many times in the past to turn away from someone who needed help now. The men were still oblivious, their laughter rising in the dry wind. Talon steadied his horse, making sure his movements were quiet, calculated. He didn't want them to know he was coming until it was too late. He slowly unholstered his rifle, checking it over with practiced hands, then slid it back into place. His hand lingered on the worn leather of his saddle, and he took one last look at the scene unfolding before him. The wagon swayed gently, its wheels grinding against the rough trail, unaware of the danger creeping closer. Talon's fingers brushed against the reins, his thoughts sharp. He would wait for the right moment. He could almost feel Clara's desperation, her fight to survive matching his own desire for redemption. He kicked his heels gently into the horse's flanks, urging it forward. It was time to make his move. The wind picked up, carrying the scent of dust and impending conflict. The tension in the air was thick, as if the world was holding its breath. Talon Blackwood, a man who had long lived in the shadows, was about to step into the light, whether he was ready or not. The moon hung high in the desert sky, casting its pale light across the land, illuminating the narrow trail that cut through the Arizona wilderness. Talon Blackwood's silhouette blended seamlessly with the shadows as he crouched behind a cluster of rocks, his eyes fixed on the wagon that creaked lazily in the distance. The desert was eerily quiet, save for the occasional rustle of the wind and the distant howl of a coyote. He allowed the stillness to settle in, focusing on the task ahead. His heart beat steady in his chest, the sound muffled by the weight of the silence around him. His hand tightened around the reins of his horse, his grip firm but quiet. He had been tracking the wagon for hours, waiting for the right moment. Tonight, he would make his move. Talon had lived a life on the edge, always operating in the shadows. But this was different. He had seen the desperation in the woman's eyes, heard the faint cries carried on the wind. It had awakened something inside him, a fire that had long been dormant. He could feel the weight of his decision, the risk of what he was about to do. There was no going back now. His gun was holstered at his side, his knife sharpened and ready. His instincts screamed at him to be cautious, but there was no time to waste. The horses, tethered to the wagon, shifted uneasily in the soft night air. Talon exhaled slowly, his breath steady as he assessed the situation. The three men sitting by the wagon were already drunk, their voices rising and falling in laughter, oblivious to the quiet danger that crept ever closer. The girl, bound and gagged, lay on the floor of the wagon, her struggles becoming more frantic with each passing moment. Talon could see the muscles in her legs straining, her body fighting against the ropes that held her in place. She was terrified, but she wasn't broken. He had to move quickly. With calculated precision, Talon dismounted from his horse, his boots sinking silently into the dry earth. He pulled his coat tighter around him, blending into the shadows as he approached the wagon, every step deliberate, every sound muffled. His eyes never left the men, his mind working through the plan he had mapped out. He would unhook the horses first, keep them quiet and calm. He had learned a long time ago that the sound of hooves could alert a man to danger long before the threat arrived. Then, he would get to her. He had no idea who she was or what had brought her here, but that didn't matter. She needed help, and he was the one who would give it. As he moved closer to the horses, the woman in the wagon shifted again, and Talon froze. He could see the faintest outline of her head through the slats of the wagon, her wild eyes scanning the darkness. The instant their gazes met, she froze, her body tense. He could see her breathing quicken, the panic setting in as she realized someone was near. Without warning, Clara's muffled scream echoed through the stillness, sharp and desperate. Her body jerked violently against the ropes, her limbs flailing in a futile attempt to escape her bindings. Talon's hand instinctively went to the handle of his gun, his muscles coiling with tension. He was used to the threat of violence, the sound of a gunfight ringing in his ears. But this was different. The scream cut through the silence like a knife, raw and desperate. Clara's eyes, wide with panic, flicked from the shadows where Talon stood to the men by the fire. She thrashed harder, her muffled cries louder now, as if she could will herself free. Talon's heart clenched in his chest, and for the first time in years, he felt the sting of guilt, the weight of every choice he had made that had brought him to this moment. His breath steady, he reached for the reins of the horses, unhooking them from the wagon one by one, his movements swift and silent. The horses shifted nervously, but he kept them still with a firm hand. He glanced over his shoulder, watching the men. One of them, a burly man with a weathered face, had stood up and was scanning the darkness. Talon cursed under his breath. The man had spotted him. The tension in the air thickened, the quiet broken only by the shuffling of boots on the ground and the crackle of the fire. Talon's heart raced as he instinctively moved further into the shadows, careful not to make a sound. The man squinted into the darkness, his hand reaching for the rifle slung over his shoulder. Clara's scream had made him alert, but Talon knew the man wouldn't have time to fire before he made his move. He wasn't going to let this go any further. With one last look at the men, Talon took a step toward the wagon, his knife gleaming in the moonlight. The final act of this rescue was about to begin. The stillness of the desert night was shattered by the sharp crack of Talon's rifle. The first man dropped, his body crumpling to the earth in a heap, the life draining from him before he even had a chance to understand what had happened. The others spun, their hands immediately reaching for their weapons, panic setting in as they tried to react. Clara's breath caught in her throat as the chaos unfolded before her. She had no idea who this man was, but he had just killed one of her captors with a single shot. Her heart pounded in her chest, the gag still in her mouth, muffling her screams. She watched as the remaining two men scrambled, pulling their guns, their movements frantic and disjointed. It all happened so fast. Talon was a blur of movement, his body fluid as he ducked behind the wagon, his rifle swinging into position with deadly accuracy. The second man had barely raised his gun before Talon's shot rang out again. The bullet hit him square in the chest, knocking him back as if the force of it had slammed into him like a freight train. He crumpled to the ground, his weapon falling from his hand with a soft, metallic clink. The world seemed to slow as Talon's eyes flicked to the final man, who was now standing frozen, wide-eyed with terror. Clara's pulse was deafening in her ears. She could hardly process what she was seeing. The man who had come from nowhere had just dismantled her captors with a precision that left no room for error. There was no hesitation in his movements, no sign of the mercy she might have hoped for. He was efficient, brutal even, but there was a calmness to his actions that struck her more than anything else. The last man's legs buckled beneath him as he dropped to his knees. He didn't reach for his gun, didn't try to run, simply stared at Talon with wide, panicked eyes. The cowboy's cold, unblinking gaze met his, and with a swift motion, he raised the rifle once more. The man didn't even have time to gasp before the shot rang out, silencing the night once and for all. Clara's breath hitched, and her heart hammered in her chest. The air around her seemed to vibrate with tension, the realization of what had just happened sinking into her bones. The man who had saved her wasn't a hero, he was something else entirely. The fear she had felt for the past few days, weeks, even was nothing compared to the chill that crawled up her spine now. She watched in stunned silence as Talon approached the wagon, his every movement calculated and deliberate. His boots crunched in the dust as he stopped in front of her. His face was impassive, his eyes shadowed by the brim of his hat. The stench of blood and gunpowder hung heavy in the air. He didn't seem to notice it, or maybe he was used to it. Clara flinched when he reached for the ropes that bound her hands. She wasn't sure what to expect from this man. He had killed without mercy, without warning, and now he was untying her, offering her freedom, but at what cost? Talon's hands were steady as he worked, the ropes falling away from her wrists with a quiet ease. His fingers brushed her skin as he removed the gag from her mouth, and Clara instinctively recoiled, the taste of the cloth still fresh in her throat. She coughed, sucking in air as though she hadn't realized how starved she was for it. "You're free now," Talon said, his voice low, rough. There was no warmth in his tone, no kindness, just a statement of fact. Clara's chest tightened, a knot of confusion and fear coiling inside her. She wanted to thank him, wanted to express the gratitude she knew she should feel. But instead, all she could do was stare up at him, her eyes wide and uncertain. She had heard stories of men like him, men who roamed the land with no name and no past, killing when necessary, leaving destruction in their wake. He wasn't a knight in shining armor. He was a man hardened by life, a man who had seen things she couldn't even begin to imagine. Clara's throat burned, and she swallowed hard, trying to find her voice. Her gaze dropped to his rough hands, stained with blood, still hovering near her. She could feel the weight of his presence, like a storm on the horizon. Was she safer with him, or was he just another part of the nightmare? Her hesitation was palpable, and Talon seemed to sense it. His eyes softened, just a fraction, but it was enough to make Clara's breath catch. He wasn't going to hurt her. Not physically. But the darkness he carried with him, it terrified her. He waited. No demand, no rush. He offered her his hand again, steady, unwavering, the gesture simple but heavy with meaning. He had killed for her, but did that make him a savior, or just a man trying to right a wrong in the only way he knew how? Clara stared at his hand, the space between them charged with tension. She was free. Yes, but was she truly safe? Would she ever be free of the fear that had been forced upon her? The terror that lingered even after her captors were dead. Her breath trembled as she slowly reached for him, her fingers brushing against his rough, calloused palm. It wasn't an answer, not yet, but it was a beginning, a choice. And it was hers to make. Clara stood there in the aftermath, the desert stillness heavy around them, her heart racing as she tried to process what had just happened. The last of her captors lay crumpled in the dust, and the man who had killed them all, Talon Blackwood, stood just inches away from her, his presence overwhelming. He was a stranger, a rugged figure of quiet intensity, but in that moment, he felt like everything. She was free. The words hung in the air between them, but they didn't immediately settle in her mind. She'd dreamed of this moment, imagined it countless times. Her captors dead, her restraints gone, the world open before her, but it didn't feel like she thought it would. Her eyes lifted slowly, meeting Talon's steady gaze. His face was set, unreadable, as if the violence that had just unfolded didn't faze him. The silence stretched between them, thick with confusion and fear. He hadn't offered her comfort or sympathy, but simply a quiet fact. You're free now. The relief that should have flooded her chest felt distant. Instead, her mind scrambled to understand what had just happened, what he had just done. She should have thanked him, thrown herself at his feet with gratitude, but the truth was, she didn't know how to feel. Her pulse throbbed in her ears, drowning out everything else. Her hands, still trembling, brushed against the dusty wagon, trying to steady herself. Her voice was weak, raw, a sound unfamiliar to her own ears. I don't know what to say. Talon's face softened just a fraction, and he stepped back, giving her space, though his eyes never left her. The distance between them felt vast, though it was only a few feet. His hand lingered near the rifle at his side, as if ready for any more danger, but he didn't seem worried. Not now. Clara took a shaky breath, her chest rising with the weight of emotions she couldn't quite name. Fear, yes, there was fear, but beneath it was something deeper, something unfamiliar and foreign. She'd never been so close to someone who had risked everything for her. She wasn't sure how to handle it. Why? She asked, the word escaping before she had time to think about it. She hadn't meant to sound so vulnerable, but the question had lodged itself in her throat like a stone. Why did you do this? For me? Talon's gaze flickered for just a moment, his stoic exterior cracking, but only for an instant. His jaw tightened, his hands briefly flexing at his sides as if he were still adjusting to the weight of what he had just done. His eyes, dark and guarded, seemed to look beyond her for a moment, as if seeing something only he could see. Then, with a deep breath, he exhaled slowly and met her gaze once more. You're not just any girl, he said, his voice quieter now, his rough tone softening. I've seen too much of what men like that do to women like you. And I made a promise a long time ago. To protect anyone who needed it. To give them a chance to be something more than what the world has planned for them. His words lingered in the air like the heat of the desert wind, and Clara felt something stir inside her. She had always been alone, always had to rely on herself. To hear him speak with such quiet conviction, like he believed her worth saving, was a weight she hadn't known she carried. You promised to protect me? She whispered, more to herself than to him. Talon gave a short nod, his gaze steady. Not just you. Anyone. Anyone who has been wronged. I've been there too many times to count, and I couldn't let it happen again. I couldn't let them take you. Clara felt a shiver crawl up her spine. She had no idea who this man was or why he had come after her. But there was something in his voice, something in the way he held himself that told her this was no random act. He was carrying something, a weight that matched the heaviness of the world around them. She didn't know the details of his past, but she knew that in some way their fates had become intertwined. He wasn't just a cowboy. He was a man shaped by loss, by promises made in the darkest hours, and the way he looked at her made her wonder if he had seen too much of the same darkness she had. Her mind swirled with unanswered questions, but Clara couldn't bring herself to ask him more. His words, his actions, had already revealed so much. Talon was not the kind of man who acted out of some misguided sense of heroism or duty. He acted because it was personal. And though she had no way of knowing for sure, she could feel the weight of his past pressing in on him, like it was always just a breath away from consuming him. For a long moment, Clara simply stared at him. The man who had killed to save her, who had offered her freedom with no strings attached. A man who had made a promise and, somehow, had kept it. She couldn't understand why, not fully, but she was beginning to realize that maybe it didn't matter. I don't know what to do now, she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. Talon gave her a small, knowing look. You'll figure it out, you always do. The simple words hit her like a wave, overwhelming her with the realization that, for the first time, someone believed in her. Truly believed in her. And it made her feel things she wasn't sure how to handle. Her chest tightened, and she swallowed the lump in her throat. Thank you, she whispered, though the words felt too small for the weight of what she felt. Talon just nodded. His gaze softened for the briefest moment, and in that fleeting look, Clara saw something she hadn't expected: an understanding, a kind of quiet acceptance. He wasn't just saving her from the men who had kidnapped her, he was saving her from a life defined by the fear and isolation that had haunted her for years. As Talon turned to check the horses, Clara took a deep breath. There was a long road ahead of her, and though the journey was uncertain, for the first time in a long while, she wasn't afraid to face it. Clara's chest tightened as she watched Talon saddle his horse, the flickering campfire casting long shadows across his face. She still didn't fully understand why he had saved her, or why he was offering her a place to stay. There was no easy explanation for the calm way he had taken down the men who had kidnapped her, nor the way he had stood by, waiting for her to make the next move. She had never been one to rely on anyone, least of all a stranger, especially not a man who seemed to carry the weight of the world on his shoulders. Her pride burned deep, pushing her to resist every offer he made, every gesture of kindness that she felt she didn't deserve. She was used to handling things on her own, to being self-reliant, to never needing anyone. She had made it this far without the help of anyone, and the idea of accepting it now, especially from him, felt like surrender. The idea of being indebted to him gnawed at her, and she turned away as he spoke again, his voice cutting through the quiet. You don't have to stay out here in the open, he said, his tone soft but firm. I've got a place not far from here. It's safe, and it's yours until you decide what you want to do next. Clara stiffened, her fingers tightening around the reins of the horse she had reluctantly agreed to ride. The offer hung in the air between them, unspoken doubts weaving through her thoughts. She had no idea who this man was, no idea what kind of life he lived, or why he was offering her shelter. But the alternative was walking alone in the desert with no real destination, no plan. The idea of staying with him was a bitter pill to swallow, but the road ahead was more uncertain than anything she had faced so far. Why? She asked, her voice thick with suspicion. Why would you help me? I don't owe you anything. He didn't flinch at the sharpness of her words, his gaze steady and unreadable. You don't owe me anything, he replied simply, though there was something in his eyes that hinted at an unspoken truth. But I'm not leaving you out here on your own. You'd be dead by sunrise. The bluntness of his response struck her like a slap, but she didn't know how to argue with him. The men he had killed had been ruthless, and she had been helpless against them. The realization that she had no other options but to rely on him left a bitter taste in her mouth. With a final look at the flickering flames, Clara swung herself onto the horse, her movements stiff and awkward. Talon mounted his own horse without a word, his movements fluid, as though he belonged in the saddle as much as he did on the ground. They rode in silence, the crunch of hooves the only sound breaking the stillness of the desert. Clara kept her eyes straight ahead, unwilling to acknowledge the man riding beside her. Her mind raced with 1,000 questions, but she refused to ask him anything. She didn't want to know why he had chosen to help her, why he seemed so willing to put himself in harm's way for someone like her. She didn't want to know what kind of man he was. It was safer to keep him at arm's length, to stay detached from him. As they rode on, the tension between them grew. Every now and then, she would catch a glimpse of him from the corner of her eye, his weathered face, the quiet determination in his movements. There was something about him that unsettled her, something raw and untamed, like he had seen things that left their mark on him. She had seen the scar on his hand earlier, a jagged line that cut across his knuckles, and it haunted her. It was a reminder of the kind of man he was. A man who had survived a life filled with violence. A man whose past was etched into his skin, like a map of pain. They continued on, the miles stretching out before them like a never-ending path. Clara's body ached from the long hours of travel, but she refused to let it show. She didn't want to appear weak. Not to him. She kept her posture rigid, her hands clenched tightly around the reins, determined not to let him see how much she relied on the steady rhythm of the horse beneath her. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, they reached the outskirts of the ranch. Talon slowed his horse, signaling for Clara to follow. The ranch was secluded, nestled against a backdrop of jagged hills, the small wooden cabin sitting in the shadow of the larger barn. The air was cooler here, the soft whisper of the wind rustling through the trees. Clara dismounted, her legs unsteady as she took in her surroundings. This wasn't a place for comfort, but it was safe. And that was all that mattered. Talon didn't say much as he led her toward the cabin. His presence was quiet but solid, like the land he owned, as though it was part of him. Clara followed, her mind still reeling with questions she didn't dare ask. Inside, the cabin was modest small, worn, but functional. The scent of wood and earth filled the air, and there was a small fire crackling in the hearth, its warmth a welcome relief from the chill of the desert night. Talon moved with quiet efficiency, lighting a lantern and setting out some food. Clara stood at the threshold, her body stiff, unsure of where she fit into this strange new world he had offered her. "You can rest here," Talon said, his voice low but kind. "We'll figure out what comes next tomorrow." Clara nodded, but she didn't move. She wasn't ready to let her guard down, not yet. Not with him, not with anyone. She turned toward the window, staring out at the dark, empty land that stretched beyond the cabin. The silence outside matched the silence inside, and Clara realized she had no idea what to do next. All she had ever known was survival, but survival wasn't enough anymore. The weight of the decision she had to make pressed down on her, and for the first time in a long while, she didn't know what to do with it. The cabin was smaller than Clara had expected, but there was a quiet comfort to it, something that made it feel like it belonged to the land itself. The wood was worn, the beams darkened by age and use, but everything in its place. A fire crackled softly in the hearth, its warm glow dancing over the walls, casting long shadows across the floor. The scent of pine and earth filled the air, and for the first time in days, Clara allowed herself to take a deep breath, the tension in her chest easing just a little. Talon led her inside, his movements quiet and sure, as though he knew the land and its rhythms better than anyone. The cabin wasn't much, barely furnished, with only the basics: a small bed covered in rough woolen blankets, a sturdy table, and a few mismatched chairs. Yet, there was something undeniably peaceful about it. It was as if it had been built with purpose, a refuge from the chaos that often raged beyond its walls. She took a hesitant step inside, her boots scraping the wooden floor, her eyes scanning the space. Everything felt so still, safe, but the safety was unsettling too. Clara had never allowed herself the luxury of peace. Every moment in her life had been about survival, about moving on, staying ahead of the dangers that lurked around every corner. Talon was already at the fire, preparing a small pot of something that smelled vaguely like beans. His back was to her, and she watched him for a moment. He moved with the same quiet precision that had marked his every action since he had arrived on the scene, from the moment he'd stepped out of the shadows to save her. There was strength in him, no doubt, but also something else, something softer. His calloused hands were gentle as he stirred the pot, and Clara couldn't help but notice the way his shoulders relaxed, just for a moment, as he exhaled a tired breath. She had seen the scar on his hand earlier, the jagged line that ran across his knuckles, a mark of violence, but it didn't tell her everything. Beneath his rough exterior, she knew there was something more. Something that ached with memories he didn't speak of. She could see it in the way he moved, in the quiet pauses between his words. He wasn't just the hardened man who had killed to protect her. He was a man who had lived through pain, a man who had sacrificed more than she could understand. Clara shifted uncomfortably, her wounds still stinging from the rough treatment she'd endured. Talon must have noticed her wince, because without a word, he stood and walked toward her, his face unreadable. His eyes were softer now, no longer the cold gaze of a man who had just executed a series of swift, lethal moves. Now, they were the eyes of someone who had seen too much, someone who understood suffering. "I'll take care of those cuts," Talon said softly, his voice low and rough. "You'll need to rest." Clara didn't argue. She was exhausted, her body worn from days of fear and physical strain, but she didn't want to be close to him, not yet. She kept her distance as he prepared a basin of warm water, his movements steady, deliberate. There was no urgency in his actions, just the calm of a man who had done this before, who knew what it meant to tend to another's wounds, whether physical or emotional. He motioned for her to sit, and she hesitated before taking a seat near the fire, her back stiff. Talon's hands were gentle as he began to clean the cuts on her arms, his touch light but firm. She could feel the heat of the water as it touched her skin, the sting of his ministrations, but it wasn't the physical pain that made her flinch. It was the vulnerability, the intimacy of it, the way his fingers brushed against her skin, as if he was seeing her for the first time, not just the woman who had been kidnapped, but the person beneath it all. She wanted to pull away, wanted to remain distant, but something in his touch made her hesitate. Talon wasn't asking for anything. He wasn't looking for gratitude or recognition. He was simply doing what needed to be done, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. His eyes didn't leave her as he worked, his face expressionless, but there was an understanding in them, a recognition of the hurt she had endured, of the long journey she had been forced to walk alone. Clara couldn't bring herself to thank him. She wasn't sure how. The words felt too small, too fragile for the weight of what he had done. Instead, she remained silent, her eyes lowered as he finished tending to her wounds. She didn't look up when he stood, but she could feel his presence, steady and unyielding, like the land that stretched out beyond the cabin walls. That night, as the fire burned low, Clara lay on the narrow bed, her body aching but her mind still racing. She had always been the one to keep moving, to keep running, never letting herself rest for fear that it would make her weak. But here, in this small cabin, with the warmth of the fire licking at her skin, she felt something she hadn't felt in years, something she couldn't quite name. Talon didn't sleep either. She could hear him moving around in the other room, the creak of the floorboards as he paced. She knew he was keeping watch, ever vigilant. His past was written in the way he carried himself, in the tension that seemed to hang around him like a shadow. He had seen things, done things, that had left their mark. Clara tossed and turned, her sleep restless, filled with fragments of nightmares and memories she could never escape. Talon, however, remained awake, his thoughts heavy with the faces of the men he had killed, the promises he had made and broken. His past weighed on him, but he wasn't the kind of man who would voice his regrets. He didn't have to. They were there in his silence, in the way his eyes lingered on the fire, as if trying to find peace in its flickering light. Neither of them slept easily that night, and as the first light of dawn crept through the cabin's small window, they both knew that whatever came next, they would face it together. The sun had begun its slow descent by the time Clara found herself outside the cabin, her gaze fixed on the horizon where the last rays of light bled into the sky. Talon had been quiet all day, working on the barn, his movements efficient, almost mechanical. It was as though the land itself called to him, offering a sense of purpose he couldn't find elsewhere. She had tried to keep to herself, hiding behind the walls she had built so carefully over the years. But the silence between them had begun to weigh heavily on her, a pressure that pushed at the edges of her restraint. Talon had saved her, she had no doubt about that, but there was more to it than that. There was something in his eyes, something in the way he moved and spoke, that made Clara feel like she wasn't the only one carrying the burden of past pain. She had always prided herself on keeping her struggles to herself, not wanting to be anyone's burden. But as the day stretched on, she found it harder to ignore the connection growing between them, silent though it was. Clara didn't know why she spoke up, why she finally let the words spill from her like a dam breaking. She had spent so much of her life hiding the truth, burying it deep where it couldn't hurt her. But now, with Talon's steady presence beside her, it felt impossible to keep it locked away any longer. "I wasn't always like this," Clara said quietly, her voice raw. She didn't look at him, her eyes fixed on the fading sunlight, as if she could will herself to believe the words she was about to say. "I had a life before. A family. A home." Talon didn't respond at first, but she could feel him listening, his attention unwavering. The only sound between them was the rustling of the wind through the trees and the distant calls of birds settling in for the night. "They took me," Clara continued, her voice barely more than a whisper. "A group of outlaws, just like those men. I don't know how long I was with them. Weeks, maybe longer. I was just a girl to them, a piece of property they could sell to the highest bidder. I fought every day, every single day to escape, but they were always one step ahead. Always too strong." She paused, taking a shaky breath. "I thought I was going to die there, but then, I don't know. Something changed. I ran, and I made it out. Barely." Her hands trembled as she folded them in her lap, trying to still the shaking that had overtaken her. She hadn't realized until now how much telling the truth would hurt. The memories rushed back with a vengeance, long nights chained up in dark, cold places, the constant fear of being sold, the sick feeling of helplessness that had eaten away at her soul. She had buried it all deep, too deep, but now it was all coming back to the surface. "I don't know if I'll ever be rid of the fear," she said softly, the weight of her words sinking in. "I can't. I can't be what I was before. I can't go back to that life." Talon's silence wrapped around her like a blanket. He didn't press her, didn't ask more than she was willing to give. He simply sat beside her, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from his body, yet distant enough to give her space. She didn't know why, but she found herself grateful for it. The quiet understanding in his eyes, the lack of judgment, gave her the strength to continue. "I don't want to need anyone," Clara whispered, more to herself than to him. "I don't want to be dependent on anyone. But sometimes I think, maybe I don't know how to be alone anymore." Talon's gaze was steady as he watched her, and for the first time, she allowed herself to meet his eyes. The hard lines of his face softened, just slightly, and she saw something there, a flicker of something shared between them. It was more than sympathy. It was recognition. "I know what it's like," Talon said quietly, his voice low but firm. "I've seen things. Things that leave marks. You can't get rid of them. You just learn to live with them." Clara didn't know what to say to that, didn't know how to respond to the honesty in his words. She had always assumed that no one could truly understand what she had been through, that no one could see the damage that had been done to her. But now, in the quiet of the fading day, with the sounds of the desert surrounding them, she realized something that startled her. Maybe Talon did understand. He didn't say more, didn't push for answers she wasn't ready to give, but in that silence, something shifted between them. It wasn't just the unspoken bond that formed between two people who had seen the worst of the world. It was something deeper. A shared understanding, a recognition that neither of them had to speak about the things they carried. Clara let out a slow breath, feeling the weight of her past settle slightly, just enough to allow her to breathe without drowning. Talon's presence beside her wasn't an answer to her pain. It didn't erase everything that had happened. But it was a promise, unspoken but understood. For the first time in a long time, she didn't have to carry everything alone. The night fell completely then, the stars scattered across the sky like tiny diamonds. Talon stood, and Clara followed his gaze upward. He didn't say anything, didn't try to offer reassurance or comfort, but she didn't need him to. His quiet presence spoke louder than any words could. They stood there together, silently watching the world around them, a new kind of understanding beginning to settle between them like the soft, steady rhythm of the desert night. Clara lay on the small bed, the rough blanket tangled around her legs, but it wasn't the heat that kept her awake. It wasn't the discomfort of the cabin, nor the unfamiliarity of the space. No, it was the sound. The creak of the floorboards, the snap of the fire's embers, the faint rustling of the wind outside, all of it carried her back to the nights she spent trapped in darkness, bound and helpless. Every small noise felt like a trigger, a reminder of the constant vigilance she had once needed to survive. Her heart raced, and her breath caught in her throat. She could hear the soft movement of footsteps just outside her door, Talon's quiet approach, but it was enough to send her mind spiraling. The fear, raw and jagged, surged up like a tidal wave. Every instinct screamed at her to flee, to hide, to run as far and fast as she could. She didn't trust him, not fully. He had saved her, yes, but she had been saved before, only to end up back in chains. She pulled the blanket tighter around her, staring at the shadows on the ceiling, willing herself to calm down, to remember that she was no longer in the hands of those men. She wasn't back there, locked in a cage, and yet her body couldn't stop reacting as if she still were. The door creaked, and Talon stepped inside, his presence like a shadow in the dim light. His gaze swept over her, and for a moment, he said nothing, just watched her from the doorway. Clara turned her head away, trying to hide the tremors in her hands. Talon knew the signs, she had seen them before. The panic in her eyes, the way her body tensed like a deer ready to bolt at the slightest movement. He didn't speak right away. He didn't need to. His presence alone seemed to settle the air between them, though he was fully aware that she was still a world away from trusting him, from feeling truly safe. He stood there for a moment, his own thoughts heavy with memories that weighed him down. He hadn't seen Clara's full suffering, but he knew enough to understand that it ran deep, that she was haunted by a darkness he recognized all too well. He had his own ghosts, his own battles with the past. The death of his brother, the bloodshed he had caused, the many lives he had taken in a war that had long since ended for everyone but him. The world around him had changed, but he remained the same, a man who had killed and lost, a man who had been buried by the weight of regret. Talon didn't speak of his pain, though. He never had. Some things weren't meant to be shared, not with anyone. He had buried his ghosts long ago, locked them away in a place he rarely let anyone see. But they were there, just beneath the surface, ready to rise up when he least expected it. He had hoped that, in offering Clara a place to stay, a roof over her head, he could give her a small semblance of peace, even if it meant facing his own demons along the way. Clara's voice, shaky and uncertain, cut through the silence. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her words so quiet he almost didn't hear them. I can't. I can't stop feeling like I'm still there. I can't stop thinking I'm going to be taken again." Talon stepped forward, his boots quiet on the floor, and sat down on the edge of the bed. He didn't say anything at first. He wasn't sure how to soothe her, how to tell her that she wasn't alone, that he would never let anything happen to her. His chest tightened, and he fought the impulse to reach for her, to offer her the comfort that seemed so foreign between them. "I know," he said, his voice low, rough from years of disuse. "I know the feeling. It doesn't just go away." There was a brief silence before he spoke again, his words heavy with a truth neither of them had asked for. "I lost my brother," Talon said quietly. "He was taken from me, by men I should have protected him from. I was supposed to keep him safe, but I couldn't." His eyes didn't meet hers as he spoke. "I killed for years to fill that hole. But the blood, it doesn't wash away. It never will." Clara's breath hitched, her body freezing as the weight of his words sank in. She hadn't expected him to open up, to speak about his own pain. She had been so consumed with her own suffering that she hadn't thought to wonder what Talon had been through, what demons he carried. She wasn't sure how to respond, but for the first time, she realized that he wasn't so different from her. He wasn't the stranger she had thought him to be. Sometimes, Talon continued, his voice quieter now, it feels like it's the only thing you can do. Keep going. Keep working. Keep moving. If you stop, everything starts to come back. And it's too much to bear. Clara nodded, though her throat ached as she did. She understood what he meant, more than she ever thought she could. They were both running from something, trying to outrun the weight of their pasts. Talon stood, brushing the dust from his pants as he did. You don't have to talk about it, he said softly, glancing back at her before turning toward the door. But you're safe here, Clara. And you'll be okay. You'll find your way. Clara didn't say anything. She couldn't find the words. But as she lay back against the pillow, staring up at the ceiling, she felt the tightness in her chest loosen just a little. Talon had made no promises, had given no assurances, but his presence was steady. He didn't offer her false hope, didn't try to fix her. He just was. And somehow, that made all the difference. The night stretched on, but this time the darkness didn't feel quite so suffocating. The ghosts of the past still hovered at the edges of her mind, but they were quieter now, and Clara allowed herself to believe just for a moment that maybe, just maybe, there was a future ahead that wasn't defined by fear. The morning sun poured in through the small window of the cabin, casting long beams of light that warmed Clara's face as she sat by the hearth, her hands folded in her lap. Outside, the wind carried the scent of sagebrush and earth, but the quiet seemed to hold a different kind of stillness now. The world was calm, the kind of calm that had once felt foreign to Clara, a place she could never settle in. She had been running for so long that it felt unnatural to stand still, to take root. But now, as she watched the light play across the floorboards and listened to the soft creaking of the ranch, she found herself at a crossroads. Talon had saved her, brought her to this place where, for the first time in ages, she felt a sliver of peace. But peace came with its own burdens. She had been so used to moving, to escaping, to surviving on her own terms, that the thought of staying, of actually letting herself become part of this life, part of this place made her uneasy. Could she really stay here, build something with this man who had given her a chance when no one else would? Her eyes drifted to the window, where Talon was working in the yard, his broad shoulders hunched as he tended to the fence that ran along the edge of the property. His movements were steady, his hands sure as he worked the tools with quiet precision. It was as if he was fixing more than just the broken parts of the ranch, was mending something inside himself too. She could see it in the way he worked, the way he took pride in every swing of the hammer, every piece of wood that fit together perfectly. There was no rush, no desperation in him, just a quiet resolve that made her feel like maybe, just maybe, things could be different here. Clara watched him for a long time, her thoughts swirling. She didn't know what it was about this place that made her feel like she could finally exhale. There was no immediate danger, no threats lurking around every corner. But she had never allowed herself to imagine this kind of life-own of stability, of quiet moments, of rebuilding from the ground up. She had always been too afraid of what might happen if she stopped running, if she allowed herself to trust. But watching Talon, seeing the way he approached his work with such care, it made her realize something she hadn't been able to before. Maybe she didn't have to keep running. Maybe she could stay here, even for a little while, and figure out who she was when the fear wasn't always there, when the past wasn't chasing her. She didn't know how long she could stay, or what the future might hold, but for the first time, she wasn't so sure that leaving was the only option. She rose from the chair, her muscles stiff from sitting too long, and walked toward the door. Talon looked up as she approached, his expression unreadable, but there was a softness in his eyes that made her feel like he was waiting for her to make the decision. It wasn't just about staying here, or about staying with him. It was about choosing to let herself heal, to let herself believe in a future that didn't have to be defined by fear. I think I'm going to stay, she said, her voice steady, though a knot tightened in her stomach. For a while, at least. Talon didn't speak at first. His eyes softened, but he gave a single nod, as if he had already known her decision. He didn't press her, didn't try to convince her to stay forever. He simply accepted it, and in that silence, something between them shifted. It wasn't a promise, not yet, but it was a beginning. For the rest of the day, Clara stayed close to the cabin, helping Talon with small tasks. It wasn't much, but it felt important, each nail hammered into place, each piece of wood that was added to the fence. It all felt like a step toward something new. For the first time, Clara began to see herself as part of this world. Not just an outsider who was passing through, but someone who could belong here, even if only for a short time. That evening, as the stars began to pierce the dark sky, Talon and Clara sat on the porch, their shoulders nearly touching as they watched the fireflies flicker in the warm breeze. The ranch had never felt more like home. They didn't speak much, but the silence between them was comfortable, full of understanding. "You don't have to do this alone," Talon said quietly, his voice low and steady. "You don't have to carry everything by yourself, not anymore." Clara's heart tightened at the words, and for a moment, she didn't know how to respond. She had spent so long trying to survive alone, thinking that needing anyone would make her weak. But in this quiet moment, with Talon beside her, she realized that maybe it was okay to let go of that burden, at least for now. Maybe it was okay to let someone in. "I'm not sure how to stop," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. Talon's gaze never left the horizon, but there was a small, almost imperceptible smile on his lips. "You don't have to stop," he said. "You just have to let yourself begin again." Clara looked up at the stars, feeling a sense of peace she hadn't known was possible. For the first time in a long while, she could see a future that didn't just involve survival. It involved rebuilding, step by step, day by day. And maybe, just maybe, it involved a future with Talon, someone who had become a quiet part of the life she never thought she could have. The fire crackled beside them, the night wrapping them in its warmth. The future was still uncertain, but for the first time, Clara felt ready to face it, whatever it might hold. Together, they would rebuild not just the ranch, but their broken lives, one small step at a time.